Johnny Carson was America's best buddy for 30 years. Millions of families welcomed him into their living rooms each and every night. They laughed at him. They smiled at him. And with his well-known good night, he put a whole country to sleep. You'll be shocked to learn about the man that everyone assumed they knew, though. Johnny Carson became one of the most isolated individuals in America when those cameras stopped recording, and that well-known curtain finally closed. The man who started careers with a single gesture, the king of late nights, the man who could make anyone laugh, lived out his last 13 years as a ghost. You're going to learn how the most adored man on TV passed away virtually by himself, how the untimely death of his own son devastated him in ways that the public never witnessed, why he couldn't let go of grudges that caused his closest pals to be permanently cut off, and the terrible reality of what actually transpired during those last years of silence. The Johnny Carson tale you believe you are familiar with is not this one. This is the tale of how his popularity turned into a prison, and how the barriers that were supposed to keep him safe ended up trapping him till he passed away. Comedy king Johnny Carson wasn't destined to be one. He was molded by rejection, forged by loneliness, and shaped by a chilly upbringing that would follow him for the rest of his life. The first and most significant lesson was taught to a shy, bookish boy called John William Carson in the little Nebraskan town of Norfolk. Keep your true self hidden from others. With a single glance, his mother, Ruth Carson, had the ability to freeze a room. She viewed affection as a luxury she couldn't afford to provide, and she was cold, judgmental, and emotionally aloof. Johnny never felt like he could win mom favor, no matter what he did: good grades, great magic performances, or being the ideal well-behaved youngster. When Ruth passed away years later, Johnny made a decision that would surprise everyone. He was not present at her funeral. Rather, he disclosed to his attorney a detail that exposed the severity of that early injury. She was a horrible witch, he said. Here are some things that influenced the man who would go on to become America's most adored host. Magic tricks were discovered by young Johnny. It appears harmless enough at first. A lonely child discovers a pastime. All that followed, however, can be explained by something deeper. Something Johnny sorely wanted was given to him by magic: the capacity to relate to others without exposing oneself emotionally. While hiding behind deceptions and illusions, he was able to act, garner laughter, and gain acceptance. The real Johnny remained securely imprisoned. Homer, his father, might as well have been invisible, but he wasn't as mean as Ruth. He was physically there, but emotionally away, as a manager of a power firm. Johnny discovered early on that he couldn't rely on the grown-ups in his life to be caring or supportive. Thus, the child followed the advice of survivors. He adjusted. He constructed walls. He discovered how to be charming from a distance, to amuse without disclosing, to make others laugh without opening up. Johnny was 18 when he joined the Navy during World War II. You might assume that being in the military would dismantle those barriers and foster relationships with other service members. Rather, it elevated them. Johnny used magic and humor to amuse his shipmates, but he avoided genuine friendships. They established the pattern. The performance was secure. A true relationship was risky. Johnny Carson had developed a talent that would make him famous and ruin his personal life by the time he returned to Nebraska for college, where he majored in speech and radio. The knack of being endearing while remaining totally unnoticed. But since the lonely Nebraska child was on the verge of becoming the most powerful guy on television, you haven't heard anything yet. And he would lose all that truly mattered because of that power. At the age of 36, Johnny Carson took the Tonight Show stage in 1962 and asserted a position he would hold for 30 years. This is what, however, no one at the time understood. He wasn't only going to be a TV host. He was vanishing behind the most popular mask in the history of entertainment. Despite never allowing anyone to truly know him, he was able to make 20 million people feel like his greatest friends. Take a moment to consider this. It was Johnny's rule to never greet his guests before they passed through that renowned curtain. The stated explanation was that he wanted all of the reactions captured on tape to be sincere. However, the true cause was far more sinister. He spent his whole life in this manner. Despite the people he worked with on a daily basis, Johnny maintained that wall. His employees, who worked alongside him for decades, would subsequently confess something that should make you shudder. They didn't know him well. Even while he was courteous, professional, and occasionally even kind, there was always that barrier that no one could get past. The man who sat next to Johnny for 30 years, Ed McMahon, once said that while Johnny was good with millions of people, he was awful with a select few intimate ties. This is where it becomes both tragic and fascinating. He was awful at relationships, because of his emotional distance, but he was a master at television. He was constantly observing people from the outside. Therefore, he was able to read an audience. Because he was always acting rather than just being, he was able to time a joke flawlessly. He amassed an incredible amount of power. His show was bringing in over $55 million annually for NBC at its height. In today's currency, that is more than $200 million. He was the owner of The Tonight Show, not just its host. The most lucrative television hour was under the auspices of Carson Productions. Johnny could take his profession to the next level with only one gesture: inviting a comic to the sofa after their show. Jerry Seinfeld, Joan Rivers, Jay Leno, and David Letterman all credited their success to a successful night on his stage. Here's what's really tragic, though. He felt more alone the more successful he got. His chilly upbringing in Nebraska ought to have been compensated for by fame. Rather, it deepened and darkened that emptiness. Another talk show host who was close to Johnny, Dick Cavett, once talked of observing Carson at social gatherings. He claimed that you could literally see Johnny trying to be amiable with fans in an effort to avoid having to deal with genuine people. Every day, the weight of the mask increased. Behind it, Johnny Carson was drowning in loneliness that he was unable to communicate to anyone or escape. The true tragedy was only getting started, though, as everything he should have cared about most was about to be destroyed by the same mental barriers that had made him the king of late nights. Johnny Carson has 4 marriages, and the same sad pattern ran through all of the marriages. Devastating breakdown in the end, emotional estrangement in the middle, and passion at the start. You will be shocked to learn about his romantic life, though. He wasn't incapable of loving. He was afraid of receiving love in return. He had 3 boys from his first marriage, which lasted 15 years, to Jody Walcott, his college sweetheart. Friends could still see the fissures, though. Already, Johnny was displaying the same emotional detachment he had acquired as a youngster. He supported his family monetarily, but he was unable to care for their basic needs. Arguments, extramarital affairs on both sides, and a growing realization that Johnny was more dedicated to his work than to his wife were all part of the marriage. No one who knew them was surprised when they got divorced in 1963. It was unexpected how little emotional impact it appeared to have on Johnny. It was intended that his second marriage to Joanne Copeland would be different. She was a member of the Hollywood scene and was elegant and attractive. It appeared to be the ideal fit for a while. However, the same trends showed themselves. When things were too intimate or too real, Johnny would emotionally withdraw. Later on, Joanne compared living with Johnny like being married to a ghost. Although he was physically there, he was emotionally distant. She stated something that encapsulated the Johnny Carson tragedy. When their marriage ended after 9 years, he didn't know what true love looked like. However, his third marriage exposed the extent of his emotional harm. Beautiful and patient, Joanna Holland was once a model. She spent 10 years trying to figure out Johnny Carson's cardiac code. She helped him in his career. She stepped back from him. She made every effort to go to the man wearing the mask. She then astonished everyone, even Johnny, by doing something on their 10th wedding anniversary. Joanna presented him with divorce papers during what ought to have been a joyful meal, knowing that a man who shunned emotional confrontation might not be able to have a face-to-face discussion about their relationship. She had meticulously planned it. Johnny had to pay more than $20 million for the divorce, which at the time was a record settlement. The thing that will shatter your heart, though, is right here. Johnny never learned how to let someone in, despite his 4 marriages and decades of attempting and failing at love. Alexis Mass, his 4th and last wife, was not like the others. She was younger, avoided the limelight, and appeared to accept Johnny for who he was: emotionally unavailable, guarded, and remote. Even though they were married until Johnny passed away, she was never able to fully break through the barriers he had spent his entire life erecting. His 3 sons, who ought to have been the most significant individuals in his life, were instead the victims of his emotional detachment. His older kids, Christopher and Corey, came to terms with their father's restrictions. They created their own lives, avoided the limelight, and kept a courteous but aloof relationship with the man who provided them with everything but the one thing they most needed: his emotional support. Rick, his youngest son, however, was unique. Like his father, Rick was sensitive, artistic, and in dire need of connection. Despite never having known the father, Johnny Carson, he battled despair, substance abuse, and the burden of being his son. Missed chances, unsaid words, and the kind of regret that consumes a person from the inside out characterized Johnny and Rick's relationship. And Johnny's worst sorrow was going to be that regret, and the injury that would ultimately cut him off from the outside world forever. June 21, 1991. Originally intended to be just another day, it ended up becoming the day that forever altered Johnny Carson's life. Real, catastrophic, uncontrollable agony was the one thing he feared most, and that day his emotional walls failed to keep him safe. Rick, his youngest son, was traveling down a California coastal roadway. At the age of 39, he was a nature photographer who found serenity in photographing the beauty of the earth that he appeared to miss in his own life. Rick had battled substance misuse and depression for years. Being the kid of Johnny Carson and having an emotionally distant father had taken their toll. However, he was trying to take pictures of the scenery he adored as part of a nature project that day. The vehicle tumbled down an embankment 125 feet. Rick Carson was dead in an instant. A part of Johnny broke when he received the call. The barriers he had constructed were unable to block the agony for the first time in his adult life. He couldn't abandon a failed marriage or take control of a business conflict. He was gone forever, and this was his child. The people who knew Johnny the best claimed to have never seen him this way. He left The Tonight Show for 4 weeks. For a man who had not missed a night in 30 years, this was an unparalleled break. Here's what will break your heart, though. Johnny Carson was unable to let others in, even while he was in the depths of his despair and dealing with the worst disaster a parent could encounter. According to reports, he declined to go to Rick's memorial ceremony in order to prevent it from turning into a spectacle for the media. He had spent a lifetime erecting these barriers, and not even the death of his son could tear them down. In front of millions of strangers, he paid respect to Rick from behind his desk, carefully controlling his emotions, the only way he knew how. When he returned to the show, he just stated that Rick was a good man who made others want to smile when he was around, while displaying a picture of a sunset that Rick had snapped. After Rick's passing, Johnny was never the same. According to Doc Severson, his longtime band leader, and one of the few people he trusted, his eyes lost their light, and it never returned. However, there were other factors that contributed to Johnny's growing loneliness besides Rick's passing. His universe was becoming narrower and smaller every day due to another tendency in his life: his capacity to harbor resentment that never went away. And no one was more cruelly taught this lesson than Joan Rivers. Joan had been Johnny's pro-tier, his most reliable guest host, and what many people thought of as his best friend in the industry for years. He had found her, elevated her to the position of permanent guest host, and effectively made her his heir apparent. Fox gave Joan her own late-night show in 1986. It was the once-in-a-lifetime chance to emerge from Johnny's shadow and establish herself as a star in her own right. However, there was an issue. She was scared to mention anything to Johnny. Joan was aware that Johnny would not be pleased by the news, because she knew him well. Her choice would therefore follow her for the rest of her life. She accepted the offer without informing him first. Johnny felt totally betrayed when he learned about it from someone else. He refused to answer Joan's phone when she tried to call him to explain. He hung up on her when she eventually reached him. Then, when he felt deceived, Johnny Carson did what he always did. He utterly eliminated her from his life. He didn't simply cut all contact with Joan Rivers. She was banned from The Tonight Show by him. Her name was off limits for the remainder of his tenure as host. Employees referred to it as the Joan embargo. The results were disastrous. Carson is accused of pressuring guests to avoid appearing on Joan's Fox show, which contributed to its failure. After a little more than a year, the show was canceled. A few months later, her husband Edgar, who accepted responsibility for the show's failure, committed suicide. Broken by shame and loss, Joan made a valiant effort to get in touch with Johnny. She gave a call. She was a letter writer. She wrote notes of condolence. Nothing worked when Rick passed away. The door remained locked indefinitely. There was more to this than business or treachery. This exposed a far darker side of Johnny Carson: his incapacity to forgive and his craving for total control. In his universe, people vanished as soon as they crossed him. The pattern was starting to emerge. In Johnny's life, all of his relationships took the same course: first contact, increasing separation, and ultimately total disconnect. He was deliberately cutting himself off from all the people who had ever been important to him. By 1991, when he declared his retirement, Johnny Carson had established a stronghold of isolation. He had been crushed by his son's death. His emotional walls had become so thick that nearly no one could approach him anymore, and his grudges had cost him friendships. The late-night king was getting ready to become America's most lonely man. 50 million Americans saw Johnny Carson bid adieu to The Tonight Show, on May 22, 1992. One of the most watched TV shows ever was that one. Everyone who believed they knew him will be shocked by what transpired next. Johnny Carson didn't simply stop doing TV. He vanished entirely from the world. Everyone anticipated a slow fading. Perhaps a couple prime-time specials, hosting the Oscars, and some guest appearances. Instead, they were met with complete quiet. Johnny declined all requests for interviews, tributes, and public appearances. He seemed to have disappeared into thin air. He withdrew to his enormous estate perched on a rock in Malibu, a stunning stronghold with a view of the Pacific Ocean. In the eyes of the millions who had watched him nightly for 30 years, Johnny Carson was no longer there. His life settled into a subdued routine that made it clear how intense his craving for seclusion had grown. He would read for hours on end, play the drums, and gaze at the stars through his telescope. He traveled extensively alone on his yacht and played tennis on a regular basis. Johnny's choice of seclusion was a form of incarceration as well. He had lived his whole adult life as Johnny Carson, a public figure who needed constant management. He was left alone with his thoughts, his regrets, and his ghosts after the show's nightly release and retirement. Rick still carried the silent grief of his loss with him every day. Wounds festered in the stillness while his resentments, such as the one against Joan Rivers, remained unresolved. To keep the outside world out, he had constructed his life like a fortress, but he was imprisoned inside it in his last years. Then his spirit started to manifest itself in his body. It was evident in the early years of The Tonight Show that Johnny had smoked heavily for the most of his life. The harm was already done, even if he had retired in the 1970s. He required quadruple bypass surgery after suffering a major heart attack in March 1999. It served as a sobering reminder of his impending death. But as usual, he handled it in total secrecy, disclosing very little to the public. He was diagnosed with emphysema, a cruel and progressive lung disease that gradually robs you of your breath. In September 2002, he denied claims that he was terminally ill, but he understated the severity of the illness. However, the emphysema was triumphant. The more the illness worsened, the smaller Johnny's world became. Once in charge of a stage in front of millions of people, the man was now confined to his own house. His vitality was gone, and his breathing was strained. He spoke to a small group of people in his last discussions. According to reports, he confided in his brother Dick about his illness, and revealed that those smokes had been the cause of his demise. Johnny Carson passed away at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles early on January 23, 2005. Emphysema-related respiratory failure was listed as the official cause of death. He was 79. Despite having his wife Alexis by his side, he passed away after spending the last 13 years in extreme loneliness. There was no public memorial service because of his enduring need for solitude. His relatives received his ashes after his corpse was burnt. In total secrecy, the man who had spent 30 years in the spotlight was buried. It was a startling contrast. Few people saw him leave this world, but 50 million people watched him leave television. Tributes flooded in from all across the world as soon as word of his passing spread. A statement was released by President Bush. He was dubbed the gold standard of television by Jay Leno. Perhaps the most poignant homage was given by David Letterman, who claimed that no one would ever equal Carson's accomplishment, and that everyone who followed him were imposters. The realization of what Johnny Carson's narrative truly stands for, however, may have been the most appropriate homage. He was an expert at reducing loneliness.